But our next speaker is Peter Lurie. Dr. Lurie is president of the Center for Science in the Public Interest, or CSPI. Previously, he was the Associate Commissioner for Public Health Strategy and Analysis at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and he's also a Food Forum member. Dr. Lurie?
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Peter, you're going to need to swap your screen.
Yes. Okay, here we go. That one, right?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Cypress. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. The first challenge in presenting this talk was to come up with acceptable alliteration for the title. So excuse the sort of exaggerated alliteration and the neologism here. I'm going to talk about history, this new word hypo-regulation, meaning insufficient regulation, and hype. And you'll see me cover all these. I have no conflicts to disclose. CSPI is an organization that accepts no donations from either government or from industry. We do have a magazine, though, and this is it. You may have heard of it, Nutrition Action Healthletter. And here, in fact, is a cover issue from May of 2018, which was about personalized nutrition specifically. So that tells you that the whole issue has been on our radar for a while. It's tough coming after day two of this meeting because day two is sort of suffused with hope and possibility. And I'm not here to say that there is no hope or possibility here. In fact, I'm very excited by the underlying science for many of these technologies. But I also know from my own experience in the public interest world and at FDA that just having exciting science is not enough to get you to the goalpost, which is ultimately the improvement of the public health. And the question really is whether or not there is a way to get from the science to the public health, and in particular, if there's a role for government in assuring that that takes place. And I believe that there is. The thesis of my talk, though, is that the current structures available to the government are inadequate to the task. So one place to start is in the past, and there's a long history here of precision medicine, as it's been called. And for decades now, we have always heard about the excitement of precision nutrition. There have been a number of books, editorials, et cetera, that have promised great things from precision medicine for literally decades. And I must say that in my view, the hype has always exceeded what's been delivered. But I also think that we're now entering a period where we are finally seeing some of the payoffs of all of this work. But in the intervening period, there were decades, literally, in which people were promised that they would get only the drugs that they needed, only the drugs that wouldn't cause them adverse events, and the like. And it just really wasn't forthcoming. One reason for that is that if you segregate the potential group that would receive the drug by their genomic sequence, for example, you actually end up decreasing your market. And I think that that is one of the reasons that the field didn't take off quite as quickly as it might have. Of course, there were also some scientific obstacles as well. But interest has certainly accelerated once the genome was sequenced. The best results have been in oncology, where the mutations tend to be simpler. A key question, though, is what is the mutation prevalence? And by how much does that mutation actually increase risk? Simply to identify a mutation that is associated with some outcome, perhaps in a very large study, is many steps away from actually having a public health impact. And there have been much less success in more complex diseases than in oncology. So one way in which you can measure the growth of precision medicine at FDA is by looking at a category of products called companion diagnostics, a category created by statute. The idea here is that you have a drug that does a certain thing, and it's supposed to be used in association with a diagnostic, a companion diagnostic. So the first approval of a companion diagnostic, it goes back to 1998, which was the use of a companion diagnostic that could detect either HER2 or alleles for HER2 in a patient's tumor, and through that predict tumor responsiveness to a drug for breast cancer called trastuzumab. And so that was a historic moment in the development of this whole field. Since then, there have been 46 companion diagnostics approved by the FDA. Almost all of them have been for various cancers, and then I list a few non-cancers for which there are companion diagnostics as well. So these diagnostics fall into a kind of regulatory maelstrom at FDA. The larger category of diagnostics are called in vitro diagnostics, and within them, there's a subset called laboratory developed tests. FDA has long asserted that it has authority to regulate these laboratory developed tests under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but that's been subject to some controversy. I'll get into that in a moment. So what is an LDT, a laboratory developed test? In general, these are tests where the sample is collected in one place and then submitted to another place where the actual testing is done. So they're send-out tests as opposed to sending, a blood sample down to your path lab, which does your complete blood count and, in the hospital and then sends it back to you later in the afternoon. These are the send-outs. FDA has long exercised what it calls enforcement authority over LDTs, which is it enforces when it wants to and uses its judgment in deciding which are the best places to act. Now, in general, though, that enforcement authority has infrequently been exercised. And one reason is that industry has asserted that there's no need to invoke FDA authority here because under Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, there's something called CLIA, the Comprehensive Laboratory Improvement Act, which they say, the industry says, provides adequate oversight. But the problem is that CLIA regulates laboratories and the process of testing. It does not regulate the tests themselves. And that's a big problem. And the results, if you restrict yourself to CLIA, are a number of deficiencies in LDT oversight. The first is that there's a lack of evidence supporting the clinical validity of these tests. So CLIA assesses what's called analytical validity. Can you hit a blank? Can you identify a positive? Can you identify a negative? That's a very different question than deciding how to use the test, how to label the test, for whom it's indicated. And that's part of what FDA would bring to bear in this question. In addition, there's inadequate adverse event reporting under CLIA. There's no pre-market review. That's critical of any performance data. You can have unsupported manufacturer claims. There's inadequate product labeling because the focus is on the laboratory, not the test. And then you have an uneven playing field because there are some companies that will get pre-market approval from FDA and have all of these deficiencies addressed. But if you go through the LDT pathway, you end up with much less regulation. And so the playing field is uneven. The big sort of elephant in the room in the last administration was a memo from Secretary Azar that came out in the summer of 2020, which used the pandemic as an excuse to address a longstanding complaint by the industry over the regulation of LDTs. And what the Azar memo said was, whereas FDA had made an attempt under the Obama administration to regulate these laboratory developed tests using a process called guidance, what the Azar memo said was that you had to instead regulate it by regulation, one by one, a separate regulation with notice and comment, Federal Register notices and the like for each and every product, which is another way of saying there will be no regulation at all for all practical purposes. So that memo has actually not been withdrawn yet, although there, I believe, are plans afoot to do so. But this memo literally took FDA out of the business of LDTs indefinitely. And that was on the wish list for industry for quite a long time. So there are examples of problematic LDTs, and this is from a report that I did while I was at FDA. We identified 20 examples of these, and here are a few of them. One of them was an ovarian cancer screening test, which was said to increase the risk of cancer and to predict therapeutic response. But when a larger study was done, that association with the particular mutations was not confirmed. The risk of, in effect, a false positive would be unnecessary surgery for people who believed that they had ovarian cancer when they did not. There is also a collection medium for the human papillomavirus test made by a company called SurePath. This one was prone to false negative tests for cancerous strains of HPV. And so the result is you could be reassured that you didn't have cervical cancer or some precancerous lesion, but incorrectly so. And then there was an autism biomarker test, which was a combination of heavy metals and other biomarkers, which were said to identify the causes of a child's autism. No scientific basis for any of this, but as fate would have it, care clinics also had a therapeutic plan, which included a number of the treatments that might be identified as appropriate for children with autism, including chelation therapy, hyperbaric oxygen, that kind of thing. I'll just say that during the pandemic, there have been 32 warning letters for COVID diagnostics for LDTs. So the problem is real and it is present. Now, there's another complicated element to FDA regulation that I'll try and explain to you. It's called the wellness policy. And this is laid out in a guidance. And it's for what are called low-risk devices, right? So in our case, low-risk diagnostics. Diagnostics are devices under FDA rules. And so what the FDA does in this guidance is establish a safe harbor for what it calls general wellness products. And that means that if you comply with the two criteria there, FDA will not regulate you. And you will not be subject to pre-market review, adverse event reporting, good manufacturing practices, all of that, as long as you meet these two criteria. So the first is it's got to be an actual general wellness product, which means that you're trying to maintain or encourage a general state of health or health activity. And the second is that it must be a low-risk product. If you meet those two criteria, you can be subject to the wellness policy, in which case you're not regulated. There are two general categories within the general wellness policy: those that do not make reference to treating, diagnosing, or preventing diseases. And so the way this would operate in nutrition, you would not be able to say treat or diagnose obesity. That would be an actual health claim, and that's not permitted under the wellness guidance. But you would be able to say maintain a healthy weight or encourage healthy eating. I'm not sure that too many patients will be clear on what the difference between maintain a healthy weight and treating obesity is, but nonetheless, that's what the distinction that the FDA guidance tries to make. It is also possible to make reference to reducing the risk of disease. You can actually do that, but the impact of the choice has to be generally accepted. So that might be heart disease, hypertension, and so forth. And an example that might be acceptable here is tracking calories to reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes. So this is the kind of thing that might be permitted under the general wellness policy. The final element of the puzzle here at FDA is the permitted claims. And broadly at FDA, there are 4 categories of claims that are permitted. We're not interested in all of them, but they're listed here for completeness. The first claim is a health claim, and that characterizes the relationship between the substance and disease and requires significant scientific agreement. And you have to run this by the FDA before you can put this on your food. So this is your classic big claim for health. There's a sort of subset of it called the qualified health claim, which is sort of similar, except has a lower standard of evidence, credible evidence, instead of significant scientific agreement. But think for the moment of just one notion being health claim, this being a subset of that. And then you have something else called the structure function claim. So this, rather than characterizing the relationship between substance and disease, instead describes the effect on normal structures or on the function of the body and requires competent and reliable scientific evidence. But if you have these, an example of this, it would be, for example, maintain strong bones would be a strong structure function claim. But if you said prevents osteoporosis, then you're back up here in the health claim category. If you have a structure function claim, and this is true for all foods, including dietary supplements, you have to have a disclaimer which says the claim was not evaluated by the FDA and that it's not, in effect, a health claim. There's another category called nutrient content claims, which characterize the level of nutrients, but that's not really of concern to us. So here are just a few examples of claims in various categories of personalized nutrition that I ran into. Here's one from a company called Persona. The way this works is you put a check in the box, in this case for brain, and if you put that check, instead of giving you everything they sell, it just gives you these 6, which are said to be advantageous for the brain in some general way. I suppose this counts as a structure function claim, but the evidence underlying how any of these are actually good for the brain, I think is open to question. Here's another one that focuses just on biomarkers. Here it's based on IgG reactivity to 96 separate foods. Whether or not IgG levels are related to allergy and whether or not that tells you ought to avoid a food is itself up for grabs. But nonetheless, here's a company selling a food sensitivity test depending upon your results to this blood test for IgG. And here are some for prebiotics, probiotics, which are said to support immune function. Again, this would be a protected structure function claim. And in fact, they go on to tell you exactly which food would be good for you, somehow based on that assessment of your microbiome. This person should eat apples, but for some reason avoid kale. I'd like to see any real data that support that assertion. Here's another microbiome-based one, and this one actually seems to stray from the structure function area into the health claim area. Without, as far as I know, any approval from FDA. Here they actually talk about microbiome-based precision nutrition for metabolic disease. So they are, in fact, talking about a medical condition. So this is the kind of thing that FDA, if it had adequate resources, which it doesn't, might actually take a look at. And finally, here's an example of a DNA test, just to round out the range. And then again, you get all kinds of personalized information based on that. The warning labels for misbranding, typically for making a health claim, are not uncommon. This is an analysis I did of warning letters in the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. So this has foods, it has actually cosmetics are a couple of these, and it also has dietary supplements. You can see there's a significant number of warning letters every year, perhaps increasing since this is only through July in 2021. Some of this is COVID-related claims from vitamin manufacturers in particular. But it's not uncommon to see these. Here are some for infertility. These are all ones we brought to the attention of FDA for pain related to CBD, and then for treating various depression and other mental health disorders. So quite a fair amount of activity. If FDA had adequate resources, these bar charts would go well off the top of the chart, I'm sure. So just to close up, let's just look ahead and think about where we stand. Again, an area of very exciting science, very engrossing science, and real potential. But the question is there a way to harness these new technologies in a way that delivers the most to the population? It is clear to me from day 2 that there is a way to deliver these interventions in a way that maximizes profit. But that's a different question and not my primary concern. What we have instead is an almost perfect storm of poor regulation. We have a situation in which demand is high, and that is especially true for people with high socioeconomic status or the worried well. And some of that is reflected in the advertising that you can see on the internet, in which relatively trivial things are played up as opposed to things that might actually make a clinical difference. It reminds me of the early 23andMe test, which was able to identify people who would sneeze when they looked at the light, the photo-optic reflex. Not really very helpful, but the kind of thing that you could sell, and they did with some success. So you have a group of people who are willing to pay. You have a LDT market that is largely unregulated. You have a wellness guidance that carves out a significant safe harbor for products. You have a plethora of unsupported claims, which try to make the difference between, or the distinction between structure function claims and true health claims, often a very difficult distinction for FDA to make. which in turn leads to the FDA often electing not to take action, lest they be challenged in court. All of this intersects with the always poorly regulated area at FDA of dietary supplements. And then finally, I would just point this out, whatever the dangers of precision medicine may have been, and we talked about some of them with those bad LDTs, at least there was a prescriber who was an intermediary. And that we don't have in the nutrition space. And there will be people not always well-educated in the niceties of nutrition who will have to make these decisions for themselves and therefore are subject to being misled and for sinking a lot of money into products that really won't benefit them. What we need at the end of the day is better science and better regulation. I'm encouraged by the fact that the NIH has a strategic plan now for nutrition research, which includes personalized nutrition. But I want to emphasize that identifying a mutation or any other factor in the body, be it an antibody test or some aspect of the microbiome that is associated with an increased risk of some disease, is not the same thing as saying that if it were to be addressed, that it would actually have a measurable impact upon a person's health. And even that is not the same thing as saying that it makes sound public health sense to take action based on that personalized approach as opposed to a general approach. For example, on the Beltway in Washington, there are probably people who very safely could drive at a speed greater than 65 miles an hour, and others who could drive at less. But what we found is that a practical way of administering that issue is by having one standard that meets all. That doesn't mean that's always the right thing. And the whole art here is to find those places where personalization makes sense and where a more global approach makes sense. But the appeal of the personalization should not be, winning in and of itself, because oftentimes that leads you to highly expensive and potentially ineffective interventions. So at the end of the day, what we really need is an assessment of public health impact. And I'm going to guess that Rob Califf is going to talk about that. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Peter.